Greetings. Today I'm going to tell you a story about greed, short-sightedness, self-importance, and technological disruption. And for that, we go to one of my older articles on the futurist, the Atom Award of the month of July 2017. So 4.5 years ago. And we click on this chart over here. This was the price of a New York City taxi medallion by year. Even in 2004, it was $200,000 to get a New York City Taxi Medallion. That is pretty expensive. But New York City's Taxi Medallion Authority started to get greedy. They said, hey, we're New York City. No one can compete with us. People have to come here and people have to use taxis, so let's start charging more and more and more. They went from $200,000 to $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, even up to $700,000 by 2012. Had they stopped over here, people might have complained but still would have paid the cost. But the New York City Taxi Medallion Authority had to get greedy because they had not faced any consequences yet. They had to get attracted to a round number, even though $1 million is a 42% increase from $700,000. And they decided that we're New York City and we just cannot be replaced and we can pretty much charge anything all the way up to infinity. So they shot it up to $1 million. $700,000 to $1 million. And therefore, from 2004 to 2013, they went from $200,000 to $1 million. Now, this is what happened. This became a gigantic delta between what is technologically possible and what a monopolistic incumbent vendor was able to charge. When taxis are this expensive in New York City, there was an opportunity for a startup by the name of Uber to provide a much more high-tech service and to do so at low cost, given that all these non-taxi drivers also have cars and open capacity that they could potentially take passengers along in. And being more high-tech, it had a lot of other advantages, such as the identity of both the driver and passenger are known. There's a record of rides. The driver and passenger can actually give ratings for each other. And if you leave something in an Uber car, you can actually contact your previous driver, and there's some chance you might get it back. Whereas with a taxi, there's no chance that you'll get your bag or purse or whatever back. And an Uber car is usually a lot cleaner than a taxi, certainly in terms of cigarette smoke in the upholstery and things like that. So Uber was just better in every possible way. But it was not artificially overpriced because of the Taxi Medallion Authority exploiting the taxi drivers. That's what is going on. The taxi drivers were angry at Uber, but when in fact they should have been angry at the Taxi Medallion Authority that is just charging more and more for an inert right, the privilege to be a taxi driver in New York City. So then what happened is that taxis started to lose demand, and the price fell so quickly back down to $200,000, even now 13 years later in 2017. And now they cannot even sustain a price that they had in 2004. Had they not gotten so greedy, they would not have created such a large delta of cost advantage that a startup like Uber could exploit. And this affected cities that even did not get greedy over the world. New York City is big enough that once Uber generated enough momentum within New York City, Uber became usable all over the world. Whether San Francisco, Singapore, or Sao Paulo, Uber started to take root over there. So even if the taxis in those cities were not expensive, they got outcompeted by Uber because New York City created a laboratory in which Uber could get enough momentum to spread over the world. And they created a standardized experience through Uber. So now if you go to any city in the world, you know exactly what to do. You don't have to learn about the little tricks of the particular taxis of those cities. You don't really have to worry about being ripped off for the most part. That's much less of a risk under Uber than under taxis in a foreign country. All these little advantages started to stack up. And now taxis are a thing of the past. In fact, when young people in the future look at footage from the pre-Uber era, they will ask the question about why so many cities had all these yellow cars. Why would you choose such an unattractive color? And why are so many of them yellow of all colors? So this is an example of a technological disruption that occurs when an incumbent thinks they are so irreplaceable that they can just charge more and more for exactly the same product or even a product of worsening quality. And I'll talk about other examples of where that has happened in the world after this or is about to happen as well. But sticking with Uber, how well has Uber done as a business given that they disrupted all these isolated little taxi markets across the world and unified them into a high-tech solution? So we have high-tech replacing low-tech. So let's look at some of Uber's financials. This will all be in the description box below, of course. But this is Uber's revenue by year. Even in 2014, not that long ago, the revenue was virtually nothing. It has grown. And 2020 was 11.1 billion of revenue. In 2021, it's going to be a lot more than that as well. 2020 is lower than 2019, of course, because of the COVID-19 crisis. But 2019 was 14.1 billion. This is quarterly revenue taking the first 3 quarters of 2021. As you can see, it has exceeded its pre-COVID high, even though people are using Uber less and less because they're working from home and more things are done over Zoom. So despite the telework and Zoom revolution replacing some demand of all ground transportation, including Uber, Uber still is rising in revenue. So this is the anatomy of a high-tech disruption. You get rapid growth when you convert something very low-tech, a taxi medallion, into something high-tech, an Uber ride platform that collects a lot of data around taxi rides all over the world. It even gives people information about traffic jams and accounts for that in surge pricing and all that. So the implementation of so many different types of data has been a tremendous productivity gain for all participants. And Uber is continuing to do well even in a post-COVID world, as we can see. Now, going back to the previous chart, what other examples in the world might there be of an incumbent, a low-tech incumbent, thinking it can charge more and more for a product or service that is the same in quality or even declining in quality? Well, one that we saw was OPEC and the price of oil. They believed that since the whole world was using oil and the sellers of oil were relatively few and completely irreplaceable, they could just charge more and more. And from 2007 to 2014, for the most part, the price of oil was $110 a barrel. That, however, created so much of a delta, very similar to what we see here with Uber and Taxi Medallions, that alternatives to the import of oil from OPEC started to emerge. The first of these was hydraulic fracturing, where the United States had just 2 states that were able to do horizontal drilling and access oil that could not have been accessed before. This increased the supply of world oil production by just 3% or so. And that was enough to make the price of oil fall by half, which I very famously predicted, as I detail in this video over here. And to this day, it is still not able to get anywhere close to its all-time high. For all the talk of inflation that we hear, oil today is about $70 a barrel, whereas its record high of $147 a barrel was way back in 2007. So 14 years later, it's half the price. So much for inflation. And the other very analogous example that we see is higher education, where the price is rising more and more and more, whereas the quality of true education delivered, one could generously say that it is not increasing, but the truth is that it's declining very, very rapidly. Standards are being lowered while price is rising. The only reason that disruption has not happened yet is because of the stickiness of the image of higher education. Too many employers say you need a degree to get a job, even though that degree has very little correlation to whatever job duties the employer wants an employee to do. It's even sillier when they look at a degree for someone who is 10, 20, or 30 years post that point of the degree, rather than whatever work they have done before then. The stickiness of the brand of higher education is built on centuries upon centuries of marketing, because a lot of those educational institutions have been around for a very long time, but they're burning through centuries worth of goodwill that they have accumulated through their extreme short-sightedness and out-of-control costs. And we are going to see a very similar thing with higher education, as we've seen with the Taxi Medallion situation. And I speak about that in detail in this video over here. So this is one of the best use cases of a technological disruption, and it's a very recent one. A low-tech incumbent thought they could charge more and more and more because there could never be an alternative to them. Each of those 3 examples, New York City Taxi Medallions, OPEC oil producers, and higher educational institutions, truly believed that they could never be replaced, and for a long time it was true, but they got so greedy that they just charged more and more and more, creating a larger and larger delta in which a newcomer could begin to operate and create a viable business. The delta was everything. Had New York City Taxi Medallions stayed at 400,000 or even 700,000, Uber might have been delayed by several years. Had OPEC never put oil above $70 a barrel, we might never have had fracking, and electric vehicles might have been delayed by several years. And if higher education cost the same in relation to the starting salaries of college graduates as it did in the 1980s or so, then no one would say higher education is really all that expensive, because in those days it wasn't really expensive relative to the earning of people who graduated with those degrees. and the quality of education being delivered for that degree was higher. But that is why we are seeing very predictable disruptions occur. That's why I was so easily able to predict the shatter point of oil prices, and that is why the higher education bubble is one of the next big disruptions to occur. And there's many others that I speak about on this channel, so I just spoke about 3 examples in this particular video because we don't want this video to be too long. So this is how to think about disruption. When low-tech converts to high-tech, and what is the cost advantage delta of the high-tech. Once you consider these variables, then you can predict technological disruption with considerable accuracy because you are going back to the first principles of technology and economics, which I've also described in other videos on this channel. So I hope you found this informative, and if you like this type of content and these types of stories of technological disruption, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much for watching.